Post-market surveillance, depending on which area of regulatory affairs or quality management you've worked in, can be a bit daunting, especially under the MDR and the IVDR. What I hope to give you today are just a few tips and tricks, and especially also the opportunity to ask questions. So I've been doing post-market surveillance for many, many years, so actually nearly 10 years, sadly. So I got very fond actually of this process. Good, then let's get going. So first of all, you have to understand what the term actually means. I know this is a bit very boring, you know, definitions of a term and so on, but it's one of the key aspects of regulatory affairs to actually understand what the regulations mean behind a specific process or a specific term. So for post-market surveillance, it actually doesn't only mean surveying your product in the market. It's actually something which is much more. So it actually means that you have to proactively collect information on your products in the market. You have to do this in a very systematic way. You have to plan how you're going to do it, and planning is then actually one of the documents. So the PMS plan will be one of the documents that you actually then need as part of your technical documentation to be able to say that your product is now MDR or IVDR compliant. The goal is not only to just, you know, collect data, but obviously to analyze it, to see if there are any necessary improvements that are needed, any CAPA measures or corrective and preventive action measures out there that need to be done to ensure the safety and the performance of your product. The ISO itself has a similar definition, a bit shorter, which is what we all prefer, but still it's a systematic process to collect and analyze experience on your medical device, on the devices that have been placed on the market. So knowing this, it actually brings us to this sort of process. So you can see here, it's all this sort of similar to the PDCA cycle. So plan, do, check, act. The PMS process follows the same. So you would have to begin with your post-market surveillance plan. That's one of the required documents needed to set your own declaration of conformity or for the notified body to accept the product and so on. New with the MDR, a document called Post-Market Clinical Follow-up, PMCF plan has been initiated. For IVDs, it's PMPF, Performance Follow-up instead of Clinical Follow-up. This is an additional complication or sort of documentational hurdle that the IVDR and MDR have been have introduced. Before, everything was just done by a PMS plan and the PMS report. But overall, it doesn't change much. So you still have to define, okay, for my product, which aspects are important to monitor in the market. Every product is different, so you'll be doing a lot of the monitoring in the same way, but there will be specific aspects for your product. Once you're doing your monitoring and data collection, so this is usually like an ongoing process. We have reactive and proactive data gathering and so on. We can get back more on that later on. After that, in defined intervals, you then actually go into the reporting part. So either you write a PMS report or a PSUR. Again, we'll have a look at this in more detail later on. And then you also write a PMCF or a PMPF report. And that sort of has then all your actions. So if you find anything in your data, any trends or any sort of improvements that you see or new risks that you might identify and so on, you would then start with your improvement cycle of the product and so forth. So this is where you would go into your CAPA process or change process and so on. But we'll have a look at the documents in more detail later on. And this is an ongoing circle. So this brings us to the next slide. The data collection actually is ongoing, and you're sometimes in direct contact with your users or patients, but often you have distributors in the middle. So it is something that has to be clear for everyone that this sort of data gathering is an ongoing process. Your distributors need to have contracts in place with you in which it is clearly stated that if you have any like questionnaires that you want end users to receive, that they have to send them on and so on. So it's very clear that you also clear and important that you also include post-market surveillance, data gathering, and CAPA management, vigilance, and so on as part of your distributor agreement. So that's one topic that's very often overseen, because sometimes you just see the distributor as a sales agent, but actually they're a communication tool. So just keep that in mind, and so on. The actual goal of post-market surveillance, so this is the official goal or the purpose, is to ensure the quality, performance, and safety of a device throughout its lifetime, right? So these are the few keywords that are echoed throughout the whole MDR and IVDR. So it's the same for post-market surveillance. So it's really the goal is to make sure that the products remain safe. But there are also like other goals and things that you can use post-market surveillance for. So for example, maybe you detect side effects that you hadn't imagined. Maybe you see that actually some of the risks that you maybe had identified previously are actually much more prevalent than you thought. So you might have to actually change sort of your probability classification or risks, or even introduce new risks that you hadn't thought about when writing the tech doc, and so on. You could also find influences from the environment. You can also possibly detect from feedback or reading between lines or questionnaires. You could detect some misuse or off-label use of the product that might need some further warnings, or maybe opportunities, right, for a new version of the product or an increase of the intended use purpose, and so on. But then, as stated before, so it also you use it to, define if any CAPA measures are required, and to continuously update the clinical evaluation and performance evaluation reports. So for those of you who are familiar with the MDR and the IVDR, so the clinical evaluation report or the performance evaluation report, these are documents that have to be kept up to date throughout the whole lifetime of the product, and the PMS reporting process is an input giver for those documents. So they're really integral parts from one and each other. Good. So very regulatory dryness out here, and there are a lot of guidance, or at least regulations, that you can read through, but there are also a lot of guidance documents out there. There are even a few templates that are given as MDCG guidance documents, so these are freely available. You could then just import into your quality management system. I have to say the templates are very dry, so they're not the most user-friendly templates that exist out there, but obviously they're regulatory compliant in the perfect way, because that's sort of what the guidance document says. If you use exactly that template, then you're definitely not diverting from the requirements, right? So this is just something that, if you need to look up something, just keep these in mind. I'm sure Aligned Elements can then share you the regulations, or you can send me an email or a LinkedIn message and I can just send you the list afterwards. Good. Now that was the dry part of my presentation, so we'll look forward in what it actually means in real life. So we have the design validation phase, which most of us are pretty well aware, and many startups are also very known on this sort of step. But the actual post-market surveillance process is not that easy, in the sense that it's not just selling your product out there. You have to have some key safeguards. You have to make sure that you get information from your product proactively. So that means not only just responding to complaints that customers might send you, patients might send you, and so on, but you actually have to contact them as well on a regular basis. And this post-market surveillance it's not just a one-time thing. So this is until you actually discontinue your product. You will have many of these cycles. So usually we say, depending on the risk class, the IVDR and MDR gives you the actual frequency of the updating of the reports. But if it's like a class 1 device or a class A device, then it's actually just stated that you have to write a PMS report and update when necessary, but it doesn't actually say when that is, right? But still, even there, it's gold standard to define an update frequency, or at least a minimal update frequency, and then to have several reports for several periods of the post-market phase of your product. So at market launch, you would actually have all these documents here. So you would have your post-market surveillance plan, PMPF, PMCF plan if needed. I'll get to that later on. You would have your completed risk management file, your performance evaluation report or the clinical evaluation report. And if you have a higher risk product, you would then also have the SSCP or the SSP reports that are required from the MDR and IVDR. Throughout every cycle of your post-market reporting, you would then create a PMS report or a PSUR, we'll get to that later, and a PMPF or a PMCF evaluation report. And in here, in those reports, you would say if the risk management file is still up to date or if it needs to be updated, if the performance evaluation report is up to date or the clinical evaluation report is up to date or if it needs to be updated, and the same for the SSP and SSCP reports. So that's how these sort of work together. And this is a continuous cycle until you discontinue the product. Good. Now, what sort of information do you actually gather? So the regulation states you have to proactively gather information, but the proactively gathering information is not actually that easy. So you also rely in post-market surveillance on reactive data collection. So reactive data collection is maybe the easiest. So in your post-market surveillance report, you would then just summarize all the complaints that you had in the surveillance period that you're looking at. You would say if there were any trends, you would summarize if there were any CAPAs or if any CAPAs are needed. If you have a product that requires servicing or repairs, then you would also summarize those activities and state if there's anything that might, if it's always the same part that's being repaired, maybe you have to redesign it to make it more stable, whatever, that's the kind of information that you can gather there. The same with deviations. So if you had any non-conformities, you would just review if there are any trends out there, things that you might have missed. If they just happen every couple of months, but if you look at it holistically, you might see that actually it's always the same part concerned, and you might actually want to improve that. And the same with vigilance cases, so we just review if there were any vigilance cases, if any actions would still be needed from those, and so on. So that's sort of just the sort of reporting of the reactive one. The proactive PMS input source is the more difficult one. So you need to gather market feedback, and that's one of the ISO requirements as well. And this is usually partly reactive because they can send you feedback per email, but it's not enough just to rely on the reactive feedback gathering. So the auditors, be it during your technical review or during your on-site audit, they will expect you to have a way to proactively get that market feedback. So that means either you prepare a questionnaire, for example, a questionnaire on usability, on the variants, type of product, there's maybe a size with 10 pieces, a package size with 100. Maybe you can ask them specifically, well, would you be interested in a package size of 200? Or other type of feedback on sort of performance. So are you happy with the performance? If it's like an operation instrument, is it easy to handle? Are there any things that you think need to be improved, and so on? So this can be done with questionnaires. Questionnaires are very widely accepted by the auditors. Often I see the best results if you actually already add the questionnaire as like a master. So you already sign the empty questionnaire as part of the PMS plan, because then you can show that you have planned this, and in the sense of all the questions you want to have in the questionnaire are actually stated as an annex in your PMS plan. So we always sign the questionnaire with the PMS plan, obviously in a user-friendly format that we can then just send out and so on. With the market feedback, it's also important that you don't accept no answers, right? So all of us know we get newsletters, we get questionnaires, we get surveys, and many of these we just ignore, right? So it's actually common practice to maybe have your sales guys call your distributors or the customers and see if they can maybe fill in the survey with them in the call, or actually go on site and just add this to one of the routine checks to just make sure that you at least have a big proportion of the market feedback that you could get out there, just to make sure that you have enough data to actually analyze and use in a good way. The other sort of inputs that you can gather proactively is to keep a list of similar devices, to keep monitoring the similar devices to see if they maybe had vigilance cases, and that maybe because they are quite similar, those vigilance cases, you might be able to learn from them, right? So maybe their vigilance cases could actually be risks that you hadn't identified or thought of yet. The PMPF, that's performance evaluation or clinical evaluation and so on, that's obviously very proactive. So you could also define maybe in your design and development phase, you had a few open questions, or you were only able to do a very small clinical study, and you might want to expand that or do a follow-up clinical study and so on. So those are the kind of things that you would plan in the PMPF and PMCF reports. Then obviously the literature review. So here it's pretty common practice that you just use the same literature search protocol that you would have used for the tech doc, so that you ensure that every couple of years you perform a new literature review to check that there are new literature out there that you've assessed and so on, that you keep your product as up to date as it can be, so state of the art, right? The sales review, that's sort of a mix between proactive and reactive. So either you can do it proactively to be able to use it for complaints, or you just say, well, we just look at the date when we write the report, we just look at the sales so that we can do a good complaint incidence rating, to see, obviously, if you have 10 complaints, but you only sell 10 products, you have a different result than if you have 10 complaints and you sell 10,000 products, right? And the other sort of proactive, which is also a mix between proactive and reactive, are audits. So you can plan your own internal product audits if you wish. If you have a product where you're not very certain, you could say, every 3 years I want to do a product audit to check if everything's good. Or you just state here reactively which audits you had, if there were any non-conformities relating to your product or the technical documentation of the product, and so on. So these are sort of input sources that you gather for the PMS. And from these, actually, the report is literally just a chapter on each of these topics, where you summarize if there's anything interesting, or interesting in the sense that you might have identified a few improvements, or actually identified needed actions, like needed improvements, not just a general nice to have improvement, but an actual kappa, to make sure that your product remains safe or that the tech doc remains up to date. So what are we looking for? I've already discussed most of this here, but here just as a summary again, the sales review is important to make sure if there are any trends out there, is it maybe is one type of the product selling more than the other? Have you maybe identified new target populations, new regions? Maybe there are new risks depending on the product that you have. You might see that actually it has a different effect on different ethnicities and so on. Market feedback, just as a reminder, make sure that you actually collect it. Call up the clients to make sure that you do get the data. Check similar devices, make sure that you have everything that you need, that you do keep monitoring if there are any new similar devices, obviously, because you have to keep proving your product is state of the art. Literature review, audits, PMCF, PMPF, and so on. So just make sure that all the inputs that you've gathered, you assess them. And actually, it's also required or sort of state of the art that for each of the chapters, so the chapter on your audits, for example, you have a conclusion in there stating if there are any actions. Because if you do this for each chapter individually, it's then much easier to then summarize the whole report and define if overall any actions are needed than if someone then has to read through the full report and then summarize all of it in one go. The other sort of more reactive ones, obviously here as stated before, so it's just to make sure that you do a holistic review of any events that you've had, any issues that you've had, any repairs and so on, to check if you have any improvements for your product. Now, the reports. So what is the difference between a PMPF or a PMCF report and the PMS report? So the PMCF report and the PMPF report, they actually really deal with the performance or clinical performance of your product and the safety thereon. It's very similar, right? Because we had the keywords safety and performance and so on in the PMS definition, right? So in the PMS report itself, you also keep looking at safety and risks and performance and so on. So it's very similar and so on. So often it's actually possible to justify that maybe no PMCF evaluation report is needed or PMPF evaluation report is needed. So for example, if you have a product that you maybe already had on the market as a legacy device, and you have been marketing it, selling thousands of this product for years, and you have proof of its performance, then you can actually use this often as a conclusion of, or sort of a justification, why you don't need any further PMCF evaluations, because all the sort of performance related information would be gathered also through vigilance, through CAPA review, and all that would actually be part of the PMS report. So there is a way to actually use that sort of knowledge that you already gathered previously to sort of justify why no PMPF or PMCF report is needed. But the goal, if you do need one, is the same. So you have to look at performance limitations, contraindications, misuse, clinical evidence, and then obviously ensure that the acceptability of the benefit risk ratio remains the same. The sort of setup is similar. So you have a plan that has to be prepared as part of the tech doc. And then every few years you have the PMPF or the PMCF report. You gather things like external quality assurance schemes, ring studies or clinical studies, evaluation studies, assay comparisons, reference materials. All this you summarize into the report and use to update to use one as an input source of your PMS report or the PSUR, but then also to update your performance evaluation report, the risk management file, SSCP, SSP, or to initiate any new CAPAs. So we'll have a look at two aspects of the input. So this is something that's IVD relevant. So it's expected that you use international reference materials to standardize your assays if there are any available. So have a look if the marker that you're using in your IVD maybe has a WHO international reference standard. Ideally, you would have done this research as part of your VNV. So during the development of your assay, you would have used that sort of reference material as part of your validation of the product. The same for the US. I mean, there are many reference material sources that you can look at. These are just the two most known. If there aren't any, then you can set up your own internal assay or sort of internal reference materials. So you just have to set up a clear protocol, how you make sure that your lab or your sort of lab samples can be used as internal reference samples, how you made sure that they're standardized, and so on, with an acceptance criteria, acceptance range and so on. Another thing, which is again very IVD specific, but it's also a must, or at least a very useful tool for post-market surveillance that I've been using many, many times over the past years, are certain external quality assurance schemes, also known as EQAS or EQAS. In the lay terms, we often call them the ring schemes. So these are big, well, it's not authorities, but they're companies that actually prepare official quality assurance schemes where they send out samples on a regular basis. So some are maybe twice a year, some are 4 times a year, some are 2 samples, some are 4 samples, and so on, for a specific marker and a specific assay type. And then you can actually test those in your quality control laboratory, or in the development laboratory, whatever, send in the results, and you then get a report, which anonymously, obviously, summarizes the data from all participants and the expected value that should have been obtained. And with that report, you can actually show that your standardization of your IVD assay is up to date. And this is something that you should definitely also include in your post-market surveillance reporting. So this would be post-market performance follow-up. This is directly linked to the performance of the assay, where you can then summarize all these reports, the result of your assay in line with others, but also just your sort of pass rate of these reports. And that gives you very good evidence of proactive data collection to prove performance and safety of the product. So don't forget those for any of you who work in IVDs. These are very, very important tools. The SSCP are only needed for higher risk products. Just keep those in mind. It's a summary that has to be written in lay terms. So this is something that general users have to be able to understand, and they actually have to be updated regularly. So you would actually, from the PMS reporting that you do, you would then every time prepare new SSCP or SSP reports. There are good guidance documents out there to give you more information on those. I definitely recommend that you read those in detail. Good. Last few tips. So if we go to the update frequency, the PMS plan is required for all classes. You have to prepare the version 1, or at least have a PMS plan signed at the time of CE marking or DOC signing. Officially, you have to update when necessary, and this is something that's also accepted. So generally, you don't give a mandatory update frequency for your PMS plan. It's just whenever you see something that needs to be updated, you just update it by means of your change control process. The PMS report is a different matter. So the PMS report is only needed for lower risk devices, so class 1 or class A and B. You have to release a version 1, but officially there is no clear guidance saying when that the first version has to be released, and you have to update when necessary. But again, here it doesn't mean there's an official statement that it has to be updated every 5 years or every 2 years, whatever. There's just needs to be there and needs to be kept up to date. What is generally accepted is that in your post-market surveillance process or in the PMS plan, you state that, for example, you want to write the first PMS report for your low-class risk device within maybe 2 years. And then you say you want to update it at least every 3 years or at least every 5 years and so on. But then obviously if you have issues in the market, this might mean you have to update them more frequently, but generally something like, so we have 2 years and 5 years renewal schedule, and this has been widely accepted for low risk devices. For higher risk devices, the situation is much clearer. This is what the IVDR or the MDR states. There is no if and why and when. It's clear. The PSUR has to be written every 2 years or every year for the higher class devices. The same for the SSCP, SSC, or SSP. It has to be updated every year or written every year. Good. Now, last but not least, don't just give the PMS reporting to a regulatory team or the QM team. It's best if you treat it as a team effort. If you also train the people on what it is, so your support team that maybe gather complaints or feedbacks from the market. Your sales team needs to know that there is a PMS report because they need to report maybe oral feedback that they obtained from distributors during Congress participation and so on. All this has to come to the correct team. You should also define the activities. So usually in their PMS plan, you state what activities are needed when and which ones will be done by whom, just to make sure that every sort of player knows his place and knows how to work best to achieve the best goal, right? And overall, the PMS process is very interfacing with many other processes. So there are a lot of like Schnittstellen in German with other processes that you have to keep up to date. You have to keep gathering the information and so on. But there's important that you have one person aligning everything relating to the PMS, or one team aligning the PMS activities, making sure that the to-dos are clear, making sure that the timelines are clear, and making sure that you get all the information that you need. Good. That would be it for the PMS process. So this is just a little glossary I added in the end in case you want to have the slides just as an aid. But I'll just stop sharing now. Just need to find.
Thank you very much, Camilla. You have clearly showed that you are on top of these things. Now, I'm sure that you've worked with a lot of companies on these matters. And I'm very curious to hear, are there any particular misconceptions about PMS that you find is prevalent within our business?
Yeah, so often the actual proactive part is sort of forgotten or misunderstood. In the first company I worked for, the term ring scheme and external quality assessment was a non-entity. No one knew of them, but actually it's such a useful tool that it's one of the first things if you're an IVD company. I mean, IVD with assays, that's one of the first tools to look at. And the other thing is obviously a few issues that I've seen in the past is that they, for example, just state that a literature update has to be made, but not how. And then you already have an audit finding. I mean, depending on the auditor, but we all know that there can be nice auditors and picky auditors. If you get the picky one, he will say, oh, you have to write the actual literature search protocol method, the keywords somewhere. And that's where we just say, hey, just reference the literature search protocol from your VNV. You make sure that's kept up to date and so on. So those are a few of the official things that are quickly forgotten. The same with the market feedback. That's also something that's very neglected in the sense that often you have the sales team completely working separately from the actual quality team or the regulatory affairs team. And to get everyone on board on this PMS process, that's one of the few things you need to make sure that everyone understands, that feedback is not just feedback, but it's actually feedback that could be very useful. Could be a hidden complaint, could be a hidden improvement, hidden kappa even, and so on. So that's definitely a few of the things that you should keep doing. Yeah.
Great. So from how I understand it, when it comes to selecting your input sources, you have some latitude as a company to argue why you have selected a certain. But I'm sure that in the industry that there is also kind of a de facto standard that there are input sources that you just can't leave out, regardless if it's written in the regulation or not. The auditor will just simply not accept you leaving out certain input sources. So are there any favorites there that you have that you really recommend being included?
Yeah, make sure that you know the similar devices list where you say, okay, these are similar devices to ours. Make sure you connect that to vigilance, because you know there's these vigilance databases out there where you can see all the vigilance cases of all products. You have to connect those two dots. So if you don't say in your PMS plan which similar devices exist, and you don't quickly confirm when you start writing the report that those are still the accurate ones, then you won't actually be looking for them in the vigilance cases or databases, and that's an immediate finding. So auditors will straight away look for that as well, look if it's logical or not, whatever you're looking at the vigilance cases. So it's not just looking at your own vigilance case, but connect the dot to the similar device vigilance cases as well. And that's often miss or just forgotten. Yeah.
And I assume also that you have some latitude to interpret the data that you get back. Just because somebody doesn't like your device mean that you need to do a redesign?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So obviously, the point is not to redesign your product with every PMS report that you write out there. But it's just to have an analysis. So normally with each feedback you get, you would be doing the analysis as well, right? Ongoing as part of the general processes. The PMS reporting is more the analyzing of all the feedback you received. Now, if it's just twice the feedback that you got, then you just say, well, actually, it's not very often. We have 20,000 products on the market. There's no need to do anything. So you have the power to say no need for further actions at this time. That's always a good statement, at this time. And then if you see, well, actually, it's maybe something that's very you would just dismiss, right? If you see it once, but now you've received 100 times a similar feedback, then maybe that's a problem. And then you need a very good justification if you really want to say, well, there's no need to do anything because your argumentation is being taken away because there's like 100 feedbacks out there. So a stupid example is we had a case where we started monitoring how many IFU questions we received. And we ended up seeing as part of the PMS that we actually got always the same sort of chapter, or at least the majority of the questions always related to the same chapters in different products. And then we sort of detected, well, actually, maybe it's our IFU that's not user-friendly. And that's how we could improve the process or the product and its documentation and so on for something that we would have just dismissed if we received it once. So that's where the beauty of the PMS process comes in. It gives you that sort of holistic view and so on. Yeah.
Now, it looks like a lot of documents. I think we mentioned up to 10 different documents here, a lot of input to consider, a lot of analysis, potentially a lot of justification, the creativity going on. Like, how much work is this? Is this something that you should give out externally, you think, or is it something that you need to have somebody in the company that works on this permanently? What is your experience here?
So here it depends on the class of the product, right? Because of the frequency. But then it also depends on the sales, so the number of complaints that you have. If you have many sales, many complaints, then the analysis takes a lot of time. If you're a startup that only has, 20 complaints a year, the assessment is super easy, super quick, right? So in those cases, it doesn't really make sense to give it externally because you learn so much from your product. If you give it externally, the risk or sort of human laziness risk is that you then just review the report and just sign it, right? So you lose a lot of this sort of thinking about your product opportunity that it gives you. But here, one of the things that you can always try to justify away is obviously the PMCF and PMPF reports. They're mandatory, but even the MDR and IVDR allow a justification why those won't be needed. So that's something that you should definitely think about for the justification. That could make sense to use a consultant just be sure that you're just not randomly dismissing those important documents, but you actually are justified to do so. That can save you a lot of time down the line because 60% is copy paste between both documents, be it PMS report or PMPF report. They're very similar and so on. So here again, the other thing that you can do to limit work is use references. So anything that's required in the PMPF report that is also required in the PMS report, just do it in one and reference the other. So it's much easier to do it that way, and then don't rewrite the chapter on clinical whatever in the PMS report if you've already given a chapter on that in the PMPF report, but just add the reference C PMPF report and so on.
Yeah, so this resonates a little bit with our previous theme of
the Lego.
Of not having redundancies. I see that Martin has a question for you now. I'm sorry, I need to move on to the next speaker here. Martin, please state your question in the chat, and I'm sure that Camilla will stay on and answer your question. Okay.